When did the word of wisdom become a requirement? It's a question I get asked frequently, most recently in a video I did on the scandalous 1911 photos that were taken inside the Salt Lake City Temple, which included a spittoon in the leadership rooms for the Quorum of the 12 and the First Presidency, showing that as late as 1911, some of the church leaders were still chewing tobacco. And it's a question that's probably a bit more complicated than you might think. It comes down to what you mean by a requirement. Do you mean when it became as a common habit for the faithful? Do you mean it was when leaders insisted that all members follow it? Or does it mean when it became commonplace? Because each of those questions can answer with a different year, as I'll talk about in just a few minutes. But I think perhaps the question that most people are meaning when they ask when did the word of wisdom become a requirement was when did it become part of the temple recommend questions? And the answer to that question is actually a bit more recent than you might think. So in this video, I want to talk about that moment in the early 20th century when the word of wisdom became embedded within the temple recommend questions and therefore a standard that all faithful and temple attending Latter-day Saints had to follow. And to do this, I want to highlight two important works of scholarship. This is part of my Friday series, so you want to know more about X, where I highlight either interviews with new scholars, talking about new books, looking at the sources, or in this case, highlighting some classic works of scholarship that I think more people need to be aware of. These works come from the legendary historian Thomas Alexander, one of the landmark historians that Mormonism has produced. One is an article published in Dialogue, Journal Mormon Thought, titled The Word of Wisdom from Principle to Requirement. It appeared in 1981. And then he built on that article in a book titled Mormonism and Transition, one of the most important books ever published on Mormonism, but more on that later. So in this video, I'll outline a general history of Mormon beliefs concerning the word of wisdom throughout the faith's first century. I'll then detail why circumstances changed in the early 20th century to heighten the requirements and standards that members had to follow. And then I'll touch on why the implementation of that new policy actually fits a broader cultural theme, the legacies of which we can still feel today. All right, let's jump in. Now, I don't want to give too detailed of a history of the origins of the word of wisdom. Maybe I'll cover this in future videos. Let me know if there are specific topics or angles or documents you'd like me to dissect. But a general overview will be useful for us. Early Mormons lived in an era of social reform, part of a generation of people believing that they could transform American society. And part of that, of these both religious and secular reform movements, was temperance, or a push for Americans to lay off the booze, which was so common. We think we are a drinking nation now. We don't hold a candle to how much alcohol was consumed in the early republic. And so there are these temperance societies that cropped up all across America in the first few decades of the 19th century, including in Kirtland, Ohio. Mere months before the Latter-day Saints arrived, Kirtland created its temperance society, which gives context for the Latter-day Saint story, that as Joseph Smith and several other leaders were meeting, they chewed tobacco like many, and as the common story goes, something that I'll complicate in future videos, Emma complained about cleaning tobacco stains afterwards. She herself came from a reform-minded and temperance committed Methodist group, and so as a result, Joseph Smith dictates a revelation on February 7th, 1833, later canonized as the Word of Wisdom. But notably, as the revelation itself insisted, it was not a requirement. It explicitly said it was not by commandment or constraint, but by revelation and word of wisdom. Now, there were plenty of moments in the ensuing years, including in Joseph Smith's own day, when leaders insisted that Latter-day Saints should be following it. Hiram Smith himself was very vehement in arguing that Latter-day Saints should be following the word of wisdom. But it's also common in those early years that many Latter-day Saints, including Joseph Smith, continued to drink wine, consume alcohol, or chew tobacco. And that's a pattern that follows for several decades. Brigham Young himself had the Latter-day Saints sustain in wanting to follow the word of wisdom in the early 1850s, and he himself continued to chew tobacco or drink wine of their own make, something that was protected under the word of wisdom. Perhaps most revealingly, when one of Brigham Young's sons gets called on a mission, Brigham writes a very tender letter to him saying, hey, I know that you, like me, like to use tobacco, but while you're doing the work of the Lord, you should probably hang off on it. Which shows that, yes, they understood it was something they should be following, but they largely didn't. And you can see one last historical episode before we get to the brunt of today's video. In 1898, the Quorum of the 12 and First Presidency had a debate over the question of whether the word of wisdom should be considered a commandment, including the question that Lorenzo Snow raised. He was the president of the Quorum of the 12, soon to become the president of the church, saying that members of the faith should not consume meat except during the winter. And Wilford Woodruff, president at the time, then said this, quote, President Woodruff said he regarded the word of wisdom in its entirety as given of the Lord for the Latter-day Saints to observe, but he did not think that bishops should withhold recommends from persons who did not strictly adhere to it. So you see a common trend in the 19th century for Mormons in word of wisdom. They often insisted that it was given by revelation. Latter-day Saints should follow, but they often came up short in the observance. And even among the leaders, there was a disagreement over how much Latter-day Saints should follow it and what was actually entailed within the word of wisdom. Some arguing that we should focus on the meat and the grains and all those other elements and not just the booze. And the fact that the church leadership had spittoons in their meeting rooms in the Salt Lake City Temple showed that yes, it was still an issue, which I think the spittoon in the Salt Lake City Temple is such a perfect depiction of this, that they knew it was wrong and they felt guilty, but they were still mostly doing it. So the question is, what changed in the early 20th century? By the way, if you enjoy this kind of nerdy content, make sure you are subscribed to this channel. I do deep dives on topics every Monday. I connect the past and the present every Wednesday. And then on Fridays, I pull back the curtains and talk about historian's craft, either through interviewing authors of new books and articles, dissecting primary sources behind common beliefs, or like in this video, introducing you to some classic works, like in this case, Thomas Alexander's great work on the word of wisdom, moving from a recommendation to a requirement. I also recommend subscribing to my free Kit newsletter and following me on different social media platforms, all of which you can find in the video description. And if you want to give back and support the work on this channel, you can become a member, where for a nominal fee, you get early access to the videos, you get little icons next to your name when you leave comments, and most importantly, you can feel good about supporting public-facing academic scholarship. All right, with all that said, let's get back to the word of wisdom. So while the temperance movement was quite common and influential in the 19th century, it evolved in the Prohibition movement in the early 20th century, which really influenced American society. It was an outgrowth of these previous reform efforts, but now it was pushing for the government itself to restrict access to alcohol to reform and improve American society. And give you an example of how successful the Prohibition movement was. In 1906, there were only 3 states nationwide that had passed prohibition laws. Within 13 years, by 1919, that had risen to 26, eventually culminating in a constitutional amendment which prohibited alcohol nationwide. Spoiler alert, it did not go well, but let's talk about that later. And among those who were deeply committed to the Prohibition movement was Heber J Grant, who joined the Quorum of the 12 Apostles in the 1880s and was a teetotaler. He did not believe that in having any access to alcohol. He vigorously supported the Prohibition movement, and he was upset with his colleagues who did not share his zeal. He often grew frustrated when church leaders didn't support the banning of alcohol, not just at the state state level, but even at the church's own amusement locations like Salt Air, a recreational facility that the church owned. And he argued that not only would it be good for the morals of society, but it would be a way for the church to earn good graces with the Republican Party, of which he was a part, by showing that we are committed to those same reform efforts. Now, Joseph F. Smith, who becomes president of the church in the early 1900s, mostly agrees, and he institutes a number of policies without going as far as Heber J. Grant wanted. So while Joseph F. Smith was president, you see things like this church stopped selling alcohol at church properties like Salt Air. They no longer associated with the organizations who ran saloons within the city. They also told local officials to refuse temple recommends to those who were drunkards, so it was okay to drink a little, but you couldn't be a drunkard. And perhaps most revealingly, in 1906, the First Presidency in the Quorum of the 12 started substituting water for wine in their weekly temple meetings. So this became a key theme of Joseph F. Smith's presidency. He emphasized that Latter-day Saints should follow the example of the church itself. And both Grant and Joseph F. Smith worked with the Republican Party in pushing prohibition movements. Grant held leadership positions within the Utah's chapter of the Prohibition movement, and debates among Republicans over a statewide prohibition, which finally passed in 1917, received lots of church support. But even then, with this formalization of the Prohibition movement within the LDS Church, there was still resistance to making it a requirement for temple access. So they urged saints to refrain from tobacco and alcohol, but still granted some leniency. So it was public prohibition, but private tolerance. And then even that is going to change. Because when Heber J. Grant succeeded Joseph F. Smith as the church president, he was able to finally install those reforms that he had long envisioned. Between 1918 and 1921, depending on how you define it, the church formally installed a prohibition against those who still drank alcohol or chewed tobacco from getting their temple recommend. There's probably some early documents that we don't have access to, but we definitely have a 1921 letter from George F. Richards, the president of the Salt Lake City Temple and a member of the Quorum of the 12, a name that you'll remember from my series on the second anointings, who went so far as to call bishops who attended the temple while still using tobacco and urging them to cut that back. So by 1921, we have it directed to local authorities not to allow anyone who breaks the word of wisdom from entering the temples. And then from that informal advice, it becomes a formal directive as it enters the church handbook. And to introduce you to some of the key documents to show the change, in 1928, this is what the church handbook says, quote, "It is important that all those who may desire to enter the temple for endowments or other ordinances should be encouraged by the bishopric to observe the principle of tithing as well as all other gospel principles." Added to that in 1933 is this: the applicant should also observe all other principles of the gospel, should keep the word of wisdom, not use profanity, should not join or be a member of any secret oath-bound organization, should sustain without reservation the general and church authorities in the church. Now, set aside the irony of, not allowing people to be part of secret oath-bound organizations in order to get access to the temple, where they would take, oath-bound covenants. But I think this shows the formalization of this restriction, because in that same handbook revision, it now added liquor drinking and drunkenness to the list of transgressions that would necessitate a bishop's court. So not only can you not access the temple if you're breaking the word of wisdom, but now your membership can be put on trial if you are determined to be a drunkard. There are also some pushes by several LDS authorities to broaden the definition of transgressions against the word of wisdom, some of which stuck, some of which didn't. An example of what stuck was similar measures against tobacco use, so they're not just stamping out alcohol and wine, but they're also stamping out tobacco. Other elements disappear. John and Leah Widsoe, one of the power couples of the church at the time, pushed for the church to follow other measures in the word of wisdom, like the eating of grains, the refraining of of meat. In 1933, a church magazine issue even urged the saints not to drink Coca-Cola. One of the earliest mentions I have of this, unofficial church teaching of staying away from Coca-Cola. Not all of those health movement ideas stick within the LDS Church, but at least the alcohol, the wine, and the tobacco does. Now, in the public sphere, the secular sphere of politics, the church's prohibition movement ends up being a failure. The church was fighting a losing battle, and Utah, much to Heber J. Grant's chagrin, became the 36th state to repeal the 18th Amendment, which meant that the Mormons were the ones that officially overcame the national prohibition on alcohol. Grant was apoplectic. But it's important to note that probably led to the church to double down on, if we can't police the nation writ large or secular society, we are going to reaffirm our boundaries. So a couple lessons that I think can be taken from these important decades of the 1920s and 1930s, when the word of wisdom compliance gets tethered to the Temple Recommend, is you can see how it's connected to cultural reforms, and you can also see how it's tied to these broader political efforts. But I think there's some other lessons, these cultural dynamics, that also deserve attention. All of this that I outlined came from Thomas Alexander's article on the Word of Wisdom, but now let's talk about how he expanded on that in a later book. Because a few years later, Thomas Alexander, again, one of the greatest historians Mormonism has ever produced, published the book Mormonism in Transition, A History of Latter-day Saints, 1890 to 1930. It was initially supposed to be a part of the multi-volume series that Leonard Arrington had commissioned for the church to publish in 1980 for the church's 150th anniversary. That project, which I detailed in a previous video, fell apart. But several of those volumes got published on their own, including this one. It was published by the University of Illinois Press in 1986. A new edition was recently published by Coca Books, so you can find it for cheap on Amazon. I have a link to it in the video description. Actually, please go get it from Benchmark Books and local booksellers. It remains a classic in the field. If I were to highlight on, two hands the number of books that I recommend to people, this is one of them. And among the arguments in this book that talks about how Mormonism transitioned from its parochial, polygamous group in the 19th century to a much more Americanized faith in the 20th century was chapter 13, where he talks about the word of wisdom, detailing all these things that I highlighted from his previous article, but now adding an interpretive framework in which he argues that once the Latter-day Saints lost polygamy, during the same era, they had a problem. Polygamy had defined their boundaries. It was a core test of faith. It was a way to show their devotion to church leaders. And no longer having that polygamy meant that there was a hole within society, something that was going to bind them together. In comes the word of wisdom, that the word of wisdom can play a similar role that polygamy did in defining who belongs and who doesn't, a way to police member belief and action, and test the Latter-day Saint commitment to priesthood authority. Legacies that I think are still very much in place today, where many Latter-day Saints define themselves by their commitment to the word of wisdom. Just think about how BYU takes pride in being the stone cold sober school. It is a core part of that identity, replacing that hole that polygamy had left. What's ironic, of course, then, is that this idea of the word of wisdom that was born as part of a convergence with a broader cultural movement and embrace of these larger cultural influences, that Latter-day Saints embraced temperance and prohibition because it was common in America, has now become an identifier of cultural exceptionalism. But history has no shortage of these kinds of ironies. I hope you found this video useful. I hope it answers some questions that you either had or didn't even know you had, but are still useful. This story is a great reminder of the necessity of understanding the cultural context for revelations, doctrines, and policies, that you can't understand the Mormon story without the broader context of what was going on. And if you want to learn more, again, the sources that I'm highlighting in this video are an article by Thomas Alexander, The Word of Wisdom from Principle to Requirement, published in Dialogue in 1981. You can find a link in the video description, as well as Alexander's magisterial book, Mormonism in Transition. I'll have a link to that book in the video description, but go support your local bookstores like Benchmark to get a copy. History has never been more relevant than it is today because it allows us to dissect principles and policies and ideas that may seem set in stone, but are truly the product of different moments in time and their broader context.